Madrid, 1834. The stone walls of the palace lay steeped in silence, and shadows slithered stealthily through the corridors. You have been summoned as the royal physician. The king is dead, yet your task is far darker than merely attending to a corpse. As you step into the private chambers of the deceased Ferdinand VII, the cold air cuts through your lungs. Queen Regent Maria Cristina gazes at you with tears streaming down her face. The words that fall from her lips freeze your blood. With trembling hands you approach the bed. Even in death, Ferdinand VII's body seems to scorn you. Yet, it is not his face that draws your attention, but the horrifying secret concealed beneath the silk sheets, a secret that history has chosen to keep silent, whispered for centuries, but never entered into official records. A grotesque anatomical anomaly of Ferdinand VII's excessively large and bizarrely shaped body. A tangible manifestation of his shame and distorted pride. As you begin the process of preservation, your mind drifts to the stories whispered along the palace's dark corridors, screaming spouses, custom cushions, and desperate hands striving to produce heirs despite nature's cruel mockery. And then it dawns on you, you are safeguarding not merely a body, but the physical reflection of a horrific reign of perverse and destructive power. Before you delve into these forgotten, shadow-laden stories, prepare yourself to uncover the dark secrets of history. For the truth is far more terrifying than you might imagine. Leave a comment below and share where you are listening from. Across time and space, from different corners, we shall together explore these hidden and sinister secrets of the past. An utterly surreal experience. To understand Ferdinand VII, one must first comprehend the curse into which he was born. This curse did not arrive through witches or divine wrath. It was shaped by the poisonous legacy of generations of intrafamilial royal marriages. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons intermarried cousins and nieces with uncles for generations, creating a genetic nightmare. Ferdinand VII was born as the dark fruit of this toxic bloodline, a living, breathing symbol of royal decay. He was born on October 14th, 1784, at the Palace of El Escorial. His father, Charles IV, and his mother, Maria Louisa of Parma, were first cousins, the marriage itself a calculated arrangement. The genetic lottery was rigged from the outset, and Ferdinand VII would pay nature's cruelest price. From childhood to adolescence, nature played a merciless game with Spain's future king. His sexual organ developed in a manner that defied medical explanation. Palace physicians began whispering at an early age. His Majesty possesses an organ of such extraordinary size and shape that private relations could be nearly impossible, noted one physician. Another was even more explicit. The prince's organ resembles a billiard cue, narrow at the base like a ceiling candle, thick and long at the tip, like a man's fist, and long enough to serve as a walking stick. Under the shadow of these dreadful secrets, you step into the most secret and unsettling corners of history. From birth, young Ferdinand VII's soul was thrust into darkness. At the time, male bodies were measured against classical Greek ideals, and smallness was considered elegant and aristocratic. Yet Ferdinand VII's enormous organ transformed him into nature's grotesque creation. What might be enviable in modern times was for him a deep and persistent source of shame. His childhood was crippling enough to break a man, but instructive enough to shape a tyrant. His father, Charles IV, was weak-willed, prioritizing hunting over governance. His mother, Maria Louisa, was greedy and indulgent, shamelessly exhibiting her affair with Manuel de Godoy, the de facto ruler of Spain. Ferdinand VII witnessed daily the small humiliations and great betrayals, learning bitter lessons about power, treachery, and the fragility of trust. Yet the defining factor was his physical abnormality. The palace buzzed with whispers about the royal anomaly. Servants secretly chuckled, courtiers made subtle mockery, and foreign diplomats reported Spanish embarrassment to their sovereigns. Ferdinand VII learned early that others found amusement in his most private self. They mocked him. This shame planted a seed of dark resentment in his soul, later becoming a rage that would determine how Spain served him. The young prince perceived ridicule and betrayal lurking around every corner, in the respectful gazes of his subjects, the formal address of his tutors, the forced smiles of prospective brides. His paranoia was justified. People truly mocked him, though they misunderstood why. As he entered adolescence, his tutors noticed a transformation in Ferdinand VII's spirit. He had become enigmatic, vindictive, and cruel. Servants who disobeyed him were either dismissed or worse. Ferdinand VII learned to wield the power of his position like a weapon, compensating for his body's weaknesses. In the palace's dark corridors, the young king learned to fight his own shadows. Every whisper, every giggle taught him about the world's terror. One whispered incident in the palace corridors revealed the darkness growing within young Ferdinand VII. A careless child accidentally entered the prince's room while he was changing. Ferdinand VII reacted with fury, ordering the child to be whipped and the family exiled from Madrid. The message was clear: no one who witnessed the prince's shame would remain unpunished. Ferdinand VII's personal doctor. Francisco Flores left secret and disturbing notes regarding the king's condition. His Majesty's organ is of extremely unusual form. The base is as wide as a man's thumb, yet its girth exceeds natural proportions. Its length surpasses any recorded example, naturally approximately 25 centimeters, expanding further upon arousal. Most concerning are the bizarre curvature and the additional tissues with no evident biological function. For Ferdinand VII, a normal marriage was impossible without significant medical intervention and special apparatus. Royal craftsmen secretly designed marital aids, pillows and supports allowing the prince to maintain sexual function without harming his consorts. Yet the physical challenges were only one facet. Ferdinand VII's condition left deep and lasting psychological effects. He became obsessed with elixirs and potions, promising to normalize his anatomy or enhance fertility. Alchemists and foreign physicians secretly brought to the palace with promises of miracles. All failed. The prince spent a fortune on powdered rhinoceros horn, crushed pearls and rare herbs, some claiming to reduce size, others to increase power despite its abnormal shape. All were futile. In 1802, Ferdinand VII married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. Yet this union marked the beginning of a journey from which he could never escape, the shadow of his dark past and bodily aberration. The palace's silent stone walls observed him at every step. Every whisper etched itself into his soul. The young king was learning to navigate a world where power and fear intertwined, battling his own shadows. The wedding was arranged while both were on the cusp of adolescence. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with fairy tale dreams of her future husband. Some supporters called her the desired one, and she imagined marrying a princely hero. The ceremony was magnificent. The cathedral resounded with music, and the streets of Madrid echoed with celebration. The young couple seemed a perfect royal pairing. Maria Antonia was beautiful, intelligent, and excited. Ferdinand VII appeared almost normal to the public, charming, attentive, and romantic. Yet royal weddings end, and the shadowed truths emerge with the night. The first sign appeared when Ferdinand VII's valet made an unusual request to Maria Antonia's maids. Special preparations were required for the royal bedroom. The servants did not understand, but were told it was customary for royal couples. Special pillows, oils, and various implements were brought, tools resembling medical instruments more than romantic objects. Maria Antonia, like most brides of the period, was innocent and sheltered. When Ferdinand VII entered the bridal chamber and encountered Maria Antonia's naked body for the first time, he was shocked, nearly hysterical. A servant later recounted, His Majesty screamed as though he had seen a demon. Pressed against the wall, he waved his fingers and cried, "Monster! Monster!" Witnesses feared he had completely lost his mind. Ferdinand VII's organ resembled a long stick with a thin handle and immense size, unlike anything the princess could have imagined. Its magnitude was terrifying, but what was truly shocking was its bizarre shape, curvature, strange growths, and almost alien appearance. The wedding night became less a romantic occasion than a quasi-medical procedure. Ferdinand VII's specially trained doctors were summoned to brief the horrified princess. Pillows were positioned, oils applied, and the process began in a manner resembling surgery more than romance. Private letters of the palace physicians describe an almost surreal scene. Ferdinand VII required special pillows to support his enormous organ, lest he cause himself harm. Despite all precautions, the experience was traumatic for Maria Antonia. Special measures were required for her endurance. The psychological impact on both parties was devastating. Ferdinand VII, already twisted by his bodily abnormality and paranoia, faced his wife's evident revulsion, further darkening his soul. The stone walls of the palace seemed to whisper throughout the night. This marriage, progressing like a nightmare in darkness, became a torment for both. Maria Antonia fell into what modern psychologists would classify as severe sexual trauma. To escape the horror of her marital duties, she became dependent on laudanum. Every attempt at procreation turned into a ritualized nightmare, recurring in a tragic cycle. Ferdinand VII summoned his physicians and dosed Maria Antonia with laudanum in a room specially prepared with equipment to ensure her submission. The procedure was carried out with clinical efficiency, and the couple was withdrawn to separate wings of the palace in pain. As months stretched into years, Ferdinand VII's desperation grew. He experimented with bizarre methods to overcome his wife's revulsion. Palace records reveal that Ferdinand VII ordered Maria Antonia to be bound with special restraints. Made of leather and silk, these devices added a disturbing dimension to the royal workshops. The king timed sexual activity according to astrological charts and lunar cycles, creating a palace filled with incense, rituals, and pseudo-magicians. At the peak of his despair, Ferdinand VII consulted a mystic claiming to be from the East. The king believed the unusual shape of his organ was a divine sign, and that, miraculously, Maria Antonia became pregnant twice. The palace filled with joy, and Ferdinand VII's confidence increased. Yet both pregnancies ended in catastrophic miscarriages. The first in 1804 at 4 months, the second in 1805, nearly at full term, accompanied by fatal hemorrhage. Maria Antonia's body could not escape the sexual horror imposed by Ferdinand VII. The queen never recovered from this torment. Her laudanum addiction became so severe that for the remaining 2 years of her life, she lived almost like a ghost. Instead of showing compassion for her suffering, Ferdinand VII deliberately blamed his wife for failure, believing she committed secret sins and hindered the production of heirs. She spent her final months constantly praying for sins unknown and crimes she never committed. Maria Antonia died in May 1807 at only 21 years old. The official cause of death was listed as fever and her delicate constitution, but in reality, years of trauma and hopelessness had destroyed her body and soul. Even in death, the palace's darkness did not release her. Ferdinand VII's paranoia continued to generate rumours. He was accused of poisoning her, seeking a more fertile wife. These rumours intensified immediately after the palace pharmacist's death. Maria Antonia's tragedy echoed in the shadows of the palace long after her passing. A mysterious letter she left behind was immediately seized by Ferdinand VII's agents and never seen again. According to whispered rumours, the letter confessed to poisons given to the Queen. Others claimed it revealed the dark secrets of Ferdinand VII's impossible demands on his wife and his own bodily abnormality. After Maria Antonia's death, Ferdinand VII's behaviour exposed everything. While publicly performing the rituals required by mourning, he privately appeared relieved. Within weeks, he began searching for a second wife, targeting women who had already proven their ability to bear children in previous marriages. The king's physicians struggled to mitigate his deformity and sexual inadequacy, seeking methods to make relations with future wives less traumatic. These sinister investigations opened the door to some of the most bizarre and chilling medical experiments in royal history. Surgeons attempted to reshape Ferdinand VII's anatomy, and marital aids were developed, but the king's character was already formed in a manner that would make him a universally reviled tyrant. The sexual trauma and obsession with bodily inadequacy from his first marriage had transformed Ferdinand VII into a completely merciless being toward others. He no longer viewed people as individuals, but as instruments of pleasure or obstacles to be removed. His first wife was a tool. Having failed, she had to be discarded. His subjects were servants to his power and ego. His relationships with palace staff increasingly revealed hints of his growing sadism. He issued arbitrary and cruel orders to test the limits of his power. Servants who accidentally saw him naked were not only dismissed, but often silently disappeared. Guards who failed to maintain the secrets of the royal chambers were exiled to Spain's dangerous border posts. Ferdinand VII became obsessed with the belief that people constantly mocked him. His obsession was not entirely unfounded. People did talk about his bodily condition. However, his reactions were extreme and his violence escalated. He kept lists of suspected mockers and, upon gaining power, prepared elaborate and terrifying revenge plans. By 1807, Ferdinand VII had become the centre of a dark conspiracy involving Spain's most powerful nobles and generals. These men viewed the overthrow of the weak government and the hated minister Manuel Godoy as a tool for Ferdinand VII, unaware that his sexual inadequacy and obsessions made him far more dangerous than the incompetent administration he opposed. The conspirators called themselves the Fernandinos, tirelessly working to construct Ferdinand VII's dark and desirous reputation as Lesiado, the desired one. The palace had become a labyrinth ruled by both power and fear. Ferdinand VII's dark obsessions permeated every corner of the kingdom. Propaganda praised Ferdinand VII's intelligence, patriotism, and potential as a reformist king, capable of restoring Spain to its former glory. Yet conspirators had carefully discerned his psychological instability and the increasingly disturbing behaviour he directed toward anyone opposing him. The conspiracy culminated in October 1807 with the so-called El Escorial plot, in which Ferdinand VII allegedly planned, with Napoleon Bonaparte's assistance, to depose his father. When the plan was revealed, Ferdinand VII's reaction exposed both cowardice and his refusal to show loyalty to anyone, even his co-conspirators. Rather than protecting the men who served his purpose, he discarded them one by one, confessing every detail of the plot, naming all participants, and begging forgiveness from their parents. While allies were imprisoned or exiled, this betrayal established a pattern that would define his entire reign. He would use people for his benefit and destroy them when convenient. As Ferdinand VII pursued political intrigues, his medical condition continued to worsen. Palace physicians noted that his organ continued to grow and change shape, with new abnormalities making intimate contact increasingly difficult. Some medical historians have suggested that Ferdinand VII may have suffered from megalois, a rare hormonal disorder causing continuous enlargement of male genitalia throughout adulthood. Whatever the medical explanation, the practical consequence was clear. Ferdinand VII required This awareness led to one of the most disturbing aspects of his subsequent marriages, the deliberate selection of women who could be psychologically manipulated or physically coerced into complying with his demands. Palace artisans specialized in increasingly complex marital apparatuses. Hidden workshops in the royal residence resembled a sinister hybrid of medical laboratories and torture chambers. Adjustable cushions, binding devices and tools were developed to allow Ferdinand VII's sexual activity while minimizing harm to his wives. These artisans swore absolute secrecy, and Ferdinand VII ensured their silence through generous payments and terrifying threats. Several masters working on these projects were later found dead under mysterious circumstances. Rumours claimed Ferdinand VII had them killed to prevent disclosure of the work's true nature. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and deposed Ferdinand VII, the future king faced a unique humiliation. He had lost the throne and was now a captive, aware of his shameful medical condition. French intelligence possessed extensive dossiers on the Spanish royal family, with Ferdinand VII's anatomical abnormality certainly among them. Ferdinand VII's 6-year captivity at Château de Valence was marked by medical examinations conducted with scientific curiosity by French physicians. Freed from royal protocol constraints, these doctors carried out meticulous examinations and treatments, approaching the work almost as torture. Reports found in Napoleonic archives centuries later provide the most detailed clinical description of Ferdinand VII's condition in history. His genitalia were described as so large and misshapen that they seemed less human than mythical. French doctors suggested that Ferdinand VII's condition resulted from multiple genetic disorders converging in one individual, creating the perfect storm of anatomical dysfunction. During captivity, Ferdinand VII also learned that some Spanish nobles and military leaders were fighting for his restoration. The irony was profound. Brave men died in swampy trenches and mountain passes, while the king's primary concern was managing his sexual inadequacy and producing an heir to continue his cursed bloodline. During his exile, Ferdinand VII wrote long letters to various European royals seeking potential wives who could accommodate his condition. These handwritten letters reveal a man completely detached from his subjects' suffering, obsessed solely with his private problems. While Spain burned, Ferdinand VII planned his next wedding night. Upon returning to Spain in 1814, Ferdinand VII was met by a crowd unlike anything Europe had ever seen. People threw flowers, wept with joy, and knelt as his carriage passed. Children born during the war saw for the first time the king their parents had risked death to restore, yet his mind was already consumed by more intimate concerns. His priority was not governance or rewarding those who fought for restoration, but finding a new wife capable of bearing the heir he had long been denied. The king's return marked the beginning of what historians would call the ominous decade. Yet the true misfortune lay not solely in Ferdinand VII's political tyranny, but in the increasingly desperate and bizarre measures taken to secure dynastic continuity. His sexual inadequacy had become inseparable from his political failures, creating a ruler whose personal deficiencies manifested as national calamity. Ferdinand VII's first act upon restoration was to commission an entirely new set of marital aids from Europe's finest artisans. Agents were sent to Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire to locate craftsmen producing devices for delicate royal situations. Hidden within the secret chambers of the palace, this collection represented the pinnacle of early 19th century perverse ingenuity. The king's second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, was another cousin within the endless cycle of the cursed bloodline. She arrived at the Spanish court in 1816 at 19, carrying the naive hopes typical of young princesses in arranged unions. Palace physicians instructed her servants on the special preparations required for the wedding night, yet nothing could truly prepare Isabel for the reality she would face. The wedding ceremony was a baroque display designed to conceal the king's growing desperation associated with failure. Ferdinand VII stood amidst gilded fabrics, wearing an almost uncontrollable mask of anxiety. The preceding week had been spent in consultation with physicians, alchemists, and an Ottoman expert rumoured to have arrived in Madrid under dark shadows. The wedding night became a disaster that would haunt both participants for the remainder of their short lives. Despite all preparations, devices, and consultations with European specialists, Ferdinand VII's anatomical monstrosity remained insurmountable. The screams echoing through the palace corridors that night were not cries of passion, but of genuine fear and pain. Servants discovered blood-stained sheets and broken furniture. The encounter resembled a medieval torture scene more than royal intimacy. Isabel never recovered from that first night. Observers recorded that she developed a pronounced stammer and would flinch in fear whenever Ferdinand VII entered a room. Isabel began to experience what the palace physicians had called hysterical fits, but which modern understanding would recognize as severe trauma responses. Her servants reported that she frequently woke up screaming from nightmares, warning of a monster that relentlessly pursued her in her dreams. Ferdinand VII, in turn, interpreted his wife's terror as a personal affront. His already legendary paranoia reached new heights as he began. Isabel was conspiring with foreign powers to mock his condition. From then on, his wife's correspondence was blocked, the meals tasted for poison, and her chambers searched for evidence of betrayal. The king's sexual inadequacy had become a political psychosis that permeated every corner of the palace. The pressure to produce an heir evolved into an obsession that consumed both the royal couple and the Spanish court. Ferdinand VII increasingly convened bizarre medical consultations. Physicians, anatomists, and circus performers claiming expertise in unusual anatomical issues were assembled. The royal bedchamber had turned into a sexual experimentation laboratory, testing human endurance and dignity. According to the private diary of a palace physician serving at the time, Ferdinand VII decided to invite foreign experts to observe fertility attempts. In search of a solution, the king welcomed German anatomists and French doctors into the bedroom to witness his private failures. The marital bed became a grotesque medical theatre. These observers took detailed notes and sketches, which later circulated in medical schools across Europe, turning Ferdinand VII's sexual inadequacy into a continental academic subject. Exposed to these voyeuristic medical displays, Isabel began showing full signs of psychological collapse. She stopped eating regularly, lost weight dangerously, and developed a vacant stare that servants found even more terrifying than her earlier outbursts. The young queen had become a ghost within the palace, wandering rooms that had transformed into her personal prison. The political consequences of Ferdinand VII's personal deficiencies could no longer be ignored. The rebellious American colonies viewed the king's inability to produce a legitimate heir as a divine sign of displeasure toward Bourbon rule, and revolutionary propaganda depicted Ferdinand VII as sexually impotent, a tyrant whose political failures mirrored his private ones. The king's most intimate shame had become a rallying cry for independence movements from Mexico to Argentina. Ferdinand VII's response to these challenges was paranoid and ruthless, in line with his character. He launched waves of purges against anyone he suspected of spreading rumours or supporting colonial independence. Upon his return, the re-established Inquisition investigated sexual slanders regarding the crown. Private conversations between married couples could result in imprisonment or death, creating an atmosphere of fear. The king's obsession with secrecy reached absurd heights. He had secret passages constructed throughout the palace, allowing him to move unseen between his chambers and Isabel's. He placed mirrors at strategic angles to detect potential eavesdroppers, and established a network of spies to monitor palace gossip. Meanwhile, Isabel's health deteriorated under her husband's sexual violence and psychological terror. Palace physicians recorded that she exhibited phantom pregnancies, showing signs of pregnancy despite its impossibility. These delusions offered Ferdinand VII brief moments of hope, only to be followed by crushing disappointment when reality emerged. The Queen's phantom pregnancies became a bitter irony within a palace already mired in dysfunction. Servants whispered that during these phantom pregnancies, the king would pace before Isabel's chamber, sometimes praying, sometimes cursing, as if divine intervention could somehow overcome his mechanically impossible condition. Each terminated phantom pregnancy plunged Ferdinand VII into a dark depression that paralyzed the government for weeks. By 1818, after 2 years of this nightmare marriage, Isabel finally escaped by the only means available to royal women at the time: death. She passed away in a state that palace physicians diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion. Private correspondence among the palace staff suggested that she may have hastened her death through subtle acts of self-harm. According to her confessor, her final words were a prayer of gratitude for the impending release. Ferdinand VII's reaction to Isabel's death revealed the extent of his psychological collapse. Rather than mourning his wife, he believed in enemies who might have killed her, ordering autopsies, searching for poison, and imprisoning servants suspected of conspiracy. The boundary between grief and paranoia was indistinct. Cycles of anger and suspicion consumed those around him. Queen Isabel's funeral became a terrifying spectacle that even shocked Ferdinand VII's supporters. The king insisted on repeatedly seeing the body during preparation, touched the corpse, and murmured about the wasted potential of her womb. He commissioned a death mask, displaying it in his private chambers. Visitors reported that he spoke to his deceased wife's lifeless face. Yet Ferdinand VII's desire for an heir could not be delayed by grief or madness. Within months of Isabel's burial, his advisors began negotiations for a third marriage. The challenge was finding a European princess willing to marry a king whose previous wives had met such tragic fates and whose personal peculiarities had become continent-wide legends. Negotiations proved difficult. Some candidates withdrew after private consultations with palace physicians who had served the Spanish court. Others demanded unprecedented privileges such as separate quarters and personal guards. Ferdinand VII's sexual inadequacy had become a diplomatic liability that threatened to isolate Spain from potential allies. Ultimately, the king's agents found Princess Maria Joseph Amalia of Saxony, who, due to her family's desperate finances, was willing to overlook Ferdinand VII's notorious reputation. Maria Joseph arrived in Madrid in 1819 at the age of 24. Older and more worldly than Isabel, she nevertheless inherited the cursed hopes carried by her predecessors. The third wedding was conducted with a simpler ceremony, reflecting Ferdinand VII's advancing age and the court's fatigue from repeated marital disasters. Fewer foreign diplomats attended, celebrations were subdued, and the sense prevailed that everyone was merely performing the formalities of a twice-failed ritual. Maria Joseph approached the marital duties with preparation. Briefings from Saxon physicians and personal medical devices and attendants allowed her to adopt a scientific method to her role. This practical approach proved far more effective than Isabel's romantic naivety, though it could not overcome the fundamental impossibility of Ferdinand VII's condition. The third marriage fell into a regimen of sexual attempts under planned and medical supervision, resembling surgical procedures more than expressions of marital affection. Maria Joseph meticulously recorded these sessions with the precision of a research scientist, noting times, techniques, and outcomes. Her clinical detachment further angered Ferdinand VII, who began suspecting that she viewed him not as a husband, but as a medical curiosity. His paranoia expanded to fears that she was secretly documenting his condition for foreign intelligence agencies. Ferdinand VII's spies reported that the Queen corresponded extensively with Saxon court physicians, allegedly sharing state secrets about the king's anatomy. Meanwhile, Spain continued to collapse under Ferdinand VII's mismanagement. American colonies achieved independence one by one, removing wealth that had sustained the Spanish Empire for 3 centuries. The king's obsession with sexual inadequacy prevented him from addressing the political and economic crises fragmenting his kingdom. Council meetings were postponed whenever Ferdinand VII endured a difficult marital period. Crucial decisions were delayed for weeks. Initially grateful for his return, the Spanish populace began to grasp the real cost of their restored monarch. Cities seethed with revolutionary activity. Rural areas were overrun by bandits, and the populace starved, while the king spent fortunes on sexual aids and foreign medical advisors. Spain became a laughingstock of Europe, its most intimate failures displayed as symbols of a kingdom in decline. In 1829, after a decade of clinical marriage, Maria Joseph achieved what many thought impossible. She became pregnant. The news rippled through the Spanish court and European diplomatic circles, sparking debates over how Ferdinand VII had finally overcome his anatomical barriers. Some attributed it to divine intervention, others to medical advances. The most malicious whispered rumors of infidelity and illegitimate heirs. Ferdinand VII's reaction was a mixture of elation and terror. He maintained additional guards to protect Maria Joseph, summoned Europe's best physicians, and had their chambers consecrated by Madrid's religious authorities. His desperation to safeguard this miraculous pregnancy bordered on madness, as he feared that enemies might sabotage the unborn heir by supernatural or scientific means. The pregnancy progressed normally until the 7th month, when Maria Joseph began experiencing complications. Palace physicians were baffled. Modern medical knowledge identifies this as placental abruption, a condition that could have been managed with proper care. However, Ferdinand VII's interference consulting mystical and alchemical advisors alongside physicians, created a chaotic environment that made effective intervention impossible. On May 18, 1829, Maria Joseph gave birth prematurely. The birth was a scene of terror for all present. Ferdinand VII insisted on supervising the process personally, despite lacking medical knowledge. The infant, a girl, lived only a few hours due to premature birth complications. Maria Joseph survived, but never regained her strength, succumbing 3 weeks later to what physicians described as puerperal fever, likely a combination of infection and despair. Ferdinand VII's reaction to this double tragedy revealed that his mind had entirely collapsed. He refused to allow the burial of either mother or child, ordering the palace physicians to attempt impossible resurrections. The palace reeked of decay for nearly a week. The king, refusing to accept his losses, demanded impossible revivals from his medical team. When he finally acknowledged the death of his wife and daughter, he sank into such profound depression that palace staff feared for his life. He stopped eating, refused to see advisors, and spent his days gazing at death masks made for his third wife. The king had become a ghost wandering his own palace, while Spain crumbled around him. Yet fate had one more cruel joke for Ferdinand VII. In 1829, at the age of 45, and after years of failing to produce a living heir, he faced an unexpected fourth marriage. Advisors seeking stability for the collapsing kingdom identified Maria Cristina of Naples as a potential bride. They withheld. The fourth wedding, in 1829, became a farce that deceived no one. Maria Cristina was openly pregnant, carrying a child that could not be Ferdinand VII's. Yet the king, in pursuit of an heir, accepted the deception, believing that divine providence had finally answered his prayers in an unusual way. In 1830, Isabella II was born, representing the apex of Ferdinand VII's quest for an heir. But instead of relief, she became a source of new anxieties. The king knew the child was not biologically his, yet the fiction of legitimacy had to be maintained to preserve the dynasty. His relationship with Maria Cristina was based on mutual deception. She feigned respect, while Ferdinand VII feigned belief that the child was his own. Ferdinand VII's final years were dominated by the sexual inadequacy that had defined his adult life. On top of this, he bore the burden of maintaining a false heir, continuing desperate sexual efforts with Maria Cristina to produce a child of his own blood. These attempts were monitored by the same doctors and experts who had observed his previous failures, and with advancing age, the probability of success dwindled, making his efforts increasingly pathetic. The king's paranoia reached astonishing levels even among palace staff. He monitored his wife's chambers hourly, raided doors with armed guards, and accused Maria Cristina of imaginary acts of infidelity. These night raids terrified the Queen's attendants, who never knew when the paranoid monarch's conspiratorial accusations would fall upon them. Ferdinand VII's obsession with surveillance became grotesque. He had secret peepholes created between his chambers and Maria Cristina's, spending hours observing through these walked eyes. The issue of Isabella's paternity particularly tormented Ferdinand VII, as it represented the ultimate victory of his sexual inadequacy. A child who would inherit the throne precisely because he had failed to produce a legitimate heir symbolized the bitter irony that his greatest political achievement, the continuity of the dynasty, was also his deepest personal failure. This contradiction poisoned even his rare moments of happiness, eroding the few memories he had with his daughter. Hoping to find scientific proof to quell his doubts, Ferdinand VII consulted genealogists and physiologists. These experts, aware of the dangerous nature of their tasks, offered carefully ambiguous opinions that could be interpreted to satisfy the king. Written reports preserved in the palace archives reveal the desperate creativity of academics trying to satisfy impossible royal demands while protecting their own lives. The king's attempts to control his wife's behavior grew increasingly complex and intrusive. He appointed servants to monitor Maria Christina's correspondence, instructing them to report not only the content but also her fate. Ferdinand VII demanded detailed accounts of the Queen's daily activities, how long she prayed, which books she read, and which court members she spoke to during official appearances. Under this intense surveillance, Maria Christina displayed immense psychological resilience. She learned to compartmentalize her emotions, presenting a calm public face while enduring constant observation in private. Centuries later, her personal journal, hidden behind a false wall in her chambers, revealed the psychological toll of this scrutiny. She wrote that she felt like an actress who could not even compromise her character in her dreams. Ferdinand VII's paranoia had international repercussions, unsettling Spain's diplomatic relations. Foreign envoys reported the king's erratic behavior and the palace's instability to their governments. Marriage negotiations with European powers stalled. Potential allies questioned whether Spain could fulfill long-term commitments under such an unpredictable ruler. The king's personal inadequacy had become an international concern. His obsession with discovering assassination plots led him to perceive conspiracies in even the most innocuous activities. When Maria Christina wished to redecorate her chamber, Ferdinand VII interpreted it as a plot to hide weapons or poison. Compliments from attendants on the Queen's appearance were suspected of being coded messages. Even religious practices were scrutinized, with the king questioning whether her increased devotions were genuine or secret communication with foreign Catholic powers. The economic cost of Ferdinand VII's paranoia was staggering. The throne, security measures, spy networks, and loyalty investigations drained the Spanish treasury, while the populace suffered. He built secret passages, installed complex alarm systems, and employed multiple tasters, guards, and servants to prevent any coordinated opposition. These expenditures depleted resources that could have alleviated Spain's mounting financial crisis. The king's health began to deteriorate under the constant stress of maintaining a surveillance state. Palace physicians noted chronic insomnia, digestive issues, and nervous unrest. His paranoia created a feedback loop in which fears justified further fears, trapping him in an ever-intensifying spiral of suspicion and anxiety. His relationships with remaining family members also suffered under his mental decline. He accused even close relatives of plotting against him, interpreting ordinary family interactions as potential threats. Birthday celebrations, flower arrangements, or gift selections became tense events, with each detail scrutinized for signs of conspiracy. Even his brother Don Carlos, who had supported him during previous crises, was placed under investigation. Maria Christina's efforts to protect her daughters from Ferdinand VII's extreme suspicions created additional tensions. The king misinterpreted her protective instincts as a sign that she was influencing Isabella in ways he did not approve of. When Maria Christina sought private time with her daughter, Ferdinand VII feared she was instilling ideas that went against his expectations. Even simple acts of maternal care became entangled in the king's imagined concerns. The palace staff closest to the royal family faced enormous pressures. They were expected to provide detailed reports on the Queen's activities while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. Many developed nervous habits under this stress, and the high turnover of staff further destabilized the household. New servants, unfamiliar with the palace's complex expectations, inadvertently triggered Ferdinand VII's suspicions. Ferdinand VII's efforts to determine Isabella's parentage became increasingly meticulous and intrusive. He compiled detailed records on all men who had interacted with Maria Cristina during her time in Naples, looking for any possible connections. These inquiries extended to family histories, personal records, and even correspondence from years before Isabella's birth. The king's private quarters reflected his anxieties and personal frustrations. Portraits of former queens, medical devices, and religious items he had preserved filled the space, creating an atmosphere of somber reflection. Visitors noted a pervasive sense of tension, and even during official discussions, Ferdinand VII conducted audiences surrounded by reminders of his personal challenges. As Ferdinand VII's behavior became more unpredictable, Maria Cristina experienced increasing psychological pressure. She developed signs of stress, including fatigue, weight changes, and minor tremors that she tried to hide in public. Servants noted her constant vigilance and startled reactions to unexpected sounds. By 1832, Ferdinand VII's concerns reached an extreme point when he worried about risks from physical contact. He requested medical examinations for Maria Cristina before any direct interaction, seeking reassurance and evidence of safety. These procedures, conducted by palace physicians, placed further strain on their relationship. The international community observed Spain's turmoil with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Diplomatic correspondence from the period indicates that European powers began planning for the eventual transition of Spain's government. Ferdinand VII's personal difficulties made stable governance challenging, leading some states to quietly consider supporting regional autonomy, believing it preferable to prolonged instability under a ruler facing ongoing personal and political challenges. By 1833, Ferdinand VII's physical health finally reflected the psychological damage caused by his paranoid rule. Palace physicians recorded constant tremors, chronic digestive problems, and cognitive decline. His speech became irregular and nonsensical, filled with conspiracies and enemies existing only in his imagination. The end, after decades of dramatic dysfunction, was almost anticlimactic. Ferdinand VII succumbed to the accumulated stress of struggling with his anatomy and psychology. In his final days, he drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes summoning deceased wives, sometimes issuing orders to investigate non-existent conspiracies. In 1833, Ferdinand VII achieved the peace that had eluded him throughout life, through death. Officially recorded as gout, palace physicians privately acknowledged that he had died primarily from physical, psychological, and spiritual exhaustion, a consequence of decades of sexual frustration and political paranoia. A secret autopsy performed by the same physicians who had spent years attempting to solve his anatomical puzzles revealed the ruthless game of nature in full clarity. The king's organ had been preserved from medical examination and measured an astonishing 14 inches in length, with variable thickness from base to tip. Lesions and deformities in his internal organs made normal sexual function nearly impossible, bearing the marks of decades of failure and dark disappointment. Yet the autopsy revealed an even more horrifying truth. evidence of deliberate self-harm extending back to his adolescence. In the darkness of night and the cold silence of solitude, the king had secretly performed surgical alterations on his own body to render normal intimacy possible. These desperate, secret, and pathetic efforts had only further damaged his body, compounding physical anomalies with psychological horrors. The preserved organ, along with detailed medical drawings and written observations, was sealed in the Vatican's secret archives, where it remains to this day. Church authorities deemed the material both frightening and politically dangerous, preserving it as a secret capable of shaking humanity and politics. Historians granted access have described it as both fascinating and horrifying, a window into a private hell corrupted by the ruthless game of absolute power and anatomical fate. Ferdinand VII's death marked the end of an era, yet his legacy continued to linger like shadows over a fractured Spain. Isabella II, a daughter of uncertain biological parentage, became the heir to a kingdom torn by civil war, economic collapse, and international ridicule. Once a dominion that ruled the world, the empire. The story of Ferdinand VII demonstrated that power without wisdom is deadly. But power combined with personal dysfunction can lead to national catastrophe. His reign showed how individual psychological horrors could transform into collective trauma, how private shame could evolve into public disaster, and how intimate human failures could echo through history. Most tragic of all was the human cost of absolute monarchy. The perversions of one man determined the fate of millions. 3 dead wives, a questionable daughter, terrified subjects, a ruined kingdom, all were victims of a genetic curse that had gone awry centuries before. Ferdinand VII was both perpetrator and victim. His reign brutally illustrated how deadly power could be in unprepared hands. By 1834, when the royal physician completed the task of preserving Ferdinand VII's anatomical legacy, he must have contemplated the dark irony, the physical evidence of a reign that consumed everything it touched. His wives, children, subjects, and ultimately himself. The preserved organ was more than a mere medical curiosity. It stood as a monument to the destructive force of shame, the corruption of absolute authority, and the tragic waste of human potential. Ferdinand VII had achieved a kind of immortality, though not the one he sought. His name survived not as that of a great king or effective ruler, but as a grim warning of personal obsession masquerading as political power. His anatomical legacy remains sealed in the Vatican's vaults, a reminder that some secrets are too disturbing for history to fully confront, too human for legend to embrace, and too tragic for time to heal. The silk sheets that once covered his deformed body now draped a kingdom equally damaged, no longer functioning as nature had intended. Ferdinand VII had finally found peace, yet he left behind a Spain destined to grapple for generations with the private catastrophes he had wrought. The most perverse king in history had ended as he had lived, a source of suffering for all touched by his power, shrouded in shadows, silent and eternal.